capacity. The floor of the cargo hold was reinforced titanium, which allowed it to support the weight of the giant tanks it was designed to carry. It had a combination door and ramp which opened to the rear, 2 winches and 4 traveling gantries. The wingspan of this giant turboprop aircraft was 211 feet. It had a top speed of 460 miles an hour, and it could lift 180,000 pounds of freight. In one record attempt, it lifted 100 metric tons, about 220,000 pounds, to a height of 25,000 feet. But in spite of its success as a record breaker, the AN-22 was a disappointing aircraft in service. The Antonov Bureau would have to wait some years before it could establish genuine preeminence as a designer of giant aircraft. In the late 60s, the Ilyushin Design Bureau was given the task of designing a transport aircraft with 4 turbofan engines. It was to be in the same class as the US Air Force's C-141A Starlifter. The result was the IL-76, codenamed Candid by NATO. The prototype flew for the first time in March 1971. It was similar in appearance to the Starlifter, but a bit larger overall. Its wingspan was 165 feet and its length 153. It was a big aircraft, but by no means a giant. One of the briefs of the IL-76 was that it should replace the turbo-powered AN-12 Cub. Its designers were required to produce an aircraft that could carry almost 90,000 pounds of freight a distance of 3,100 miles in less than 6 hours. All this had to be achievable in the harshest conditions of a Siberian winter. It was a versatile aircraft. This version is able to carry and drop large quantities of fire retardant. In July 1975, the IL-76 established 25 official payload to height and payload at speed records. NATO identified 5 different versions of the basic IL-76. There is also an airborne early warning and control version known by NATO as Mainstay. Another major variant of the IL-76 was the result of 10 years of development from the mid-70s to the mid-80s. It is the in-flight refueling version known to NATO as Midas. This Midas is refueling a group of Sukhoi 27s, present-day Russia's premier frontline fighter. In the 1950s, the Soviet Air Force used a wingtip-to-wingtip system, a fuel line from the wingtip of the tanker connected to a fueling nozzle on the wingtip of the receiving aircraft. In the system used by the Midas, multiple lines are extended from the fuselage and wings of the tanker. They connect to the extendable refueling nozzles in front of the pilot's canopy on the Su-27. Using this system, it's possible to refuel 3 aircraft at one time. The tanker version of the IL-76 was originally designed to refuel larger aircraft than the Su-27. One of its purposes was to extend the range of the Tupolev Tu-22M backfire, the Soviet Union's supersonic swing-wing strategic bomber. In the mid-70s, this function theoretically became irrelevant. The in-flight refueling probe was removed from backfire Bs as a result of strategic arms limitation talks. However, many Western authorities at the time believed the refueling probe could be replaced at short notice. If that is the case, the Midas still has the potential to extend the backfire's somewhat disappointing range. Midas is certainly an effective companion to the superb Russian Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters, allowing their operational radius to extend deep into Europe and Asia. Soviet practice was always to use its aircraft as flexibly as possible. This IL-76 is performing extremely low-level cargo drop test runs. In 1967, just after the Arab-Israeli War, an article in the London Economist was headed, "Bears Can't Fly." It suggested that the reason the Soviet Union had not intervened on the Arab side was lack of strategic mobility. It suggested that the same problem affected any Soviet military action outside the Eurasian landmass, and that the Soviet Union was incapable of using small mobile forces to further its policies in remoter parts of the world. The article went on to say that if the Soviet Union attempted to solve this problem by improving its ability to move troops by air, it would be a bad omen for East-West relations. In fact, the Soviet Union was already moving in that direction. It had already negotiated permission to overfly Yugoslavia, and very shortly after the Arab-Israeli War was busy carrying arms and equipment to the defeated Arab states via Yugoslavia and Iraq. By the time the 1973 Arab-Israeli conflict broke out, the Soviet Union was in a position to offer far greater air transport assistance than had been the case in 1967. In October 1973, Soviet military transport aviation made over 1,000 resupply flights to Cairo and Damascus. US President Nixon was concerned that the Soviet Union would airlift some of its airborne divisions to intervene directly in the fighting. Nixon declared a Defense Condition 3 alert and placed the US 82nd Airborne Division on an advanced state of readiness. Soviet military transport had come a long way in just 6 years. As IL-76s began to replace the AN-12 Cub, it improved even more. By the second half of the 70s, Soviet military transport aviation and Aeroflot were able to reach deep into Africa and Asia, supplying arms, equipment, and troops. The use of Aeroflot aircraft, which appeared to be civilian, allowed the Soviet Union to avoid overt infringement of neutral airspace. In December 1979, 5,000 Soviet airborne troops were airlifted into the Afghan capital, Kabul. These troops assisted in overthrowing the Afghan regime and replacing it with a pro-Soviet group. By 1981, it was clear that the Soviet Union held an advantage in any race with the US to intervene in a military situation in the Eurasian landmass. In Soviet eyes, the situation recalled the glory days of the 1930s, when Soviet TB-3s could overwhelm enemy positions by dropping their large loads of paratroops into the heart of the action. An estimate in the early 80s was that it would take 6 days for the US to get a Marine amphibious brigade of 16,500 troops to the Persian Gulf. At the same time, the Soviet Union, using Soviet military transport aviation and Aeroflot, could have 20,000 troops on the ground there in 2 days. In those circumstances, the comparative crudity of Soviet transport aircraft became an advantage. They were generally more capable of landing on primitive airfields. Their onboard cargo handling equipment made them very self-contained. They had auxiliary power units for takeoff from poorly equipped airfields. They often carried their own ground engineers to solve any problems that might arise in the field. Outside Eurasia, the Soviet airborne divisions of the AN-12s, AN-22s, and IL-76s had their shortcomings, and America compared better. Soviet military exercises were impressive, but there was a problem with the aircraft that delivered tanks and troops to the battlefield. Production of the giant AN-22 had finished in 1974, and it had not been replaced. The smaller IL-76 was the only Soviet jet-powered heavy transport aircraft. In 1980, the first flight of a jet-powered Russian giant capable of delivering battle tanks and troops in great numbers was still 2 years away. In the meantime, there was a succession of developments in smaller Soviet transports. In the late 50s, the Antonov Bureau designed a short-range turboprop aircraft to replace the old piston-engined Lizunovs and Ilyushins on Aeroflot's feeder routes. For a Western company, operating economy would be a crucial factor. But in the Soviet Union, it was not considered important. The primary aim was to build a very tough aircraft that could cope with a very tough operating environment. The AN-24 was originally intended to carry less than 40 passengers. But by the time the prototype flew in 1960, it had become a 44-seater. Later, more seats were added. Eventually, it became a genuine 50-seater. The AN-24 went into airline service with great success. By 1969, AN-24s had carried more than 25 million passengers. A comprehensive upgrade of the AN-24 resulted in this aircraft, the AN-26, known by NATO as Curl. It was developed especially for Soviet military transport, but the service aircraft belonged, nominally at least, to the Soviet airline Aeroflot. The AN-26 can carry just over 12,000 pounds of freight. It can be converted very quickly from its standard freight configuration to accommodate troops or stretchers. The conversion only takes 20 to 30 minutes in the field. It has the unique Antonov loading ramp. When it's retracted, this ramp forms the underside of the rear fuselage. It can be slid forwards under the rear of the cabin to allow loading directly onto the floor of the cargo hold. Or it can be opened in flight if cargo or paratroops are to be airdropped. An improved version of the AN-26 was introduced in 1981. It was equipped to carry 3 large freight containers. A new loading system was built into the cargo hold. It gave a high level of operating efficiency. A crew of only 2 men could load or unload all 3 containers, the entire cargo of the aircraft, in 30 minutes or less. The AN-30 is a development of the AN-26. It's a specialized aerial survey aircraft. A glazed nose gives the navigator a wide field of vision, and the raised flight deck improves the pilot's view. It has onboard survey cameras and a photographic darkroom.